January 26, 1945. The calmer pocket France, the temperature had dropped to 14 degrees below freezing. The earth was not merely cold, it was frozen hard as stone. No soldier could dig a foxhole. No one could disappear into cover. Every man on the battlefield was completely exposed. In the center of a snow-covered clearing near the tiny village of Holtzwihr, disaster was already unfolding. A United States M10 tank destroyer burned fiercely after being struck by a German 88mm shell. Thick black smoke rolled upward into the gray winter sky. The vehicle had become a deadly trap. Its fuel tanks were torn open and gasoline leaked across the frozen ground. Inside, the ammunition had started cooking off. The entire machine was now a metal coffin waiting to erupt in flames and steel. Any rational soldier would have fled in the opposite direction. Every instinct for survival demanded escape. Yet standing on top of the burning wreck was a teenager. He was only 19 years old. Barely 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighing little more than 110 pounds, he looked less like an American officer and more like a child wearing an oversized uniform. But in his hands rested the trigger of a .50 caliber machine gun. Advancing toward him was a German force estimated at nearly 2 full companies, around 250 elite troops supported by 6 Tiger tanks. Moving through the snow in white camouflage, they expected the Americans to collapse. They expected an easy victory. What they did not expect was one furious young soldier refusing to let them pass. For nearly an hour, the boy atop the burning tank fought an entire battle by himself. He transformed the snowy field into a killing zone. German soldiers fired at him relentlessly. Grenades exploded around the wreck. Enemy troops attempted to flank his position from every direction, yet somehow they could not bring him down. His name was Audie Murphy, and this is the true story of the most decorated American soldier of the Second World War. It is the story of how a frail Texas farm boy, rejected by nearly every branch of the military for being too small, became the savior of his division. It is also the story of the anger that fueled his impossible stand and the terrible cost he carried long after the guns finally fell silent. Audie Murphy was not born a warrior. He was born into hardship. He grew up in Kingston, Texas during the darkest years of the Great Depression. His family were desperately poor sharecroppers living in a small shack patched with paper to keep the wind from blowing through the walls. His father abandoned the family while Audie was still young, and his mother died when he was only 16 years old. Suddenly, the responsibility for the family fell onto his shoulders. Younger brothers and sisters depended on him to survive. He hunted constantly with an old .22 caliber rifle, searching for rabbits and squirrels in the woods, but he followed one strict rule. Ammunition cost money. Every bullet had to bring back food. If he missed his target, the family went hungry. That was where he learned how to shoot, not on a firing range or during military drills, but in a daily struggle against starvation. Accuracy was not a talent to him, it was survival itself. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Audie immediately tried to enlist. He first went to the Marine Corps, but recruiters laughed at his tiny frame and youthful appearance. They told him to go home because the equipment weighed more than he did. He tried joining the paratroopers next, but was rejected again. One recruiter joked that the wind would carry him away before he even reached the ground. The Navy also turned him away without hesitation. Finally, the United States Army accepted him, though even there he struggled to prove himself. During basic training, he fainted during drills from exhaustion. His officers tried transferring him into the kitchen as a cook, believing combat would destroy him. Audie refused completely. He insisted he was a soldier and demanded the chance to fight. He was eventually assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division. By early 1945, the weak boy everyone mocked had proven them all wrong. He fought through the mountains of Sicily, survived the brutal mud and blood of Italy, and landed with Allied forces in southern France. Over time, he became one of the most respected combat leaders in the European theater. But Audie Murphy was never chasing medals or glory. He fought for the men beside him. Just days before the battle near Holtzwihr, he lost his closest friend in combat. To understand why he climbed onto that burning tank destroyer, it is necessary to look at what happened only 3 days earlier. January 23rd, Audie Murphy's unit walked directly into an ambush. His close friend Laddie Tipton was beside him that day. During the firefight, a German soldier suddenly stepped forward waving a white flag. Believing the enemy wanted to surrender, Tipton rose from cover to accept it. The surrender was a trap. The German soldier raised his weapon and shot Tipton dead instantly. Audie watched his closest friend collapse into the snow. Something inside him shattered in that moment. Rage completely consumed him. He grabbed a captured German machine gun and charged the enemy line alone, hunting down the men responsible for murdering his friend. From that point forward, Audie Murphy was no longer fighting only to survive or to win battles. He fought with a cold fury buried deep inside him. He carried the weight of responsibility for every man under his command. By then he was a lieutenant, not because of military schooling or privilege, but because nearly every officer above him had already been killed. By January 26th, his company had been devastated. Out of 235 men, only 19 remained alive and capable of fighting. 19 exhausted, freezing soldiers stood between the advancing German army and the collapse of the entire American line. That afternoon, in the Kalmar Pocket, the Germans launched a massive counterattack. 6 Panzer tanks rolled out from the dark woods while waves of German infantry advanced behind them wearing white snow camouflage. Against the frozen landscape, they were almost invisible until they were dangerously close to the American positions. The Americans had nowhere to hide. The ground beneath them was frozen solid, making foxholes impossible to dig. Their only heavy support consisted of 2 M10 tank destroyers, and both were eliminated almost immediately. The first M10 slid helplessly into a ditch and became trapped. The second tank destroyer was struck directly by a German 88mm shell. Flames erupted across the vehicle as the crew abandoned it and ran for the trees. The American line was collapsing. Within minutes, the battle threatened to become a slaughter. Murphy looked at the 19 men remaining under his command. He knew that if they stayed in position against enemy tanks, every one of them would die. So he made a decision. He ordered his soldiers to retreat into the woods while he covered their withdrawal alone. The men hesitated, unwilling to abandon their lieutenant. Murphy screamed at them until they obeyed. It was an order: fall back to the tree line immediately. One by one, the soldiers retreated toward the forest while Audie Murphy stayed behind completely alone. In one hand he carried a field telephone, in the other he gripped his carbine rifle. He had become the final line of defense. The German infantry continued moving closer across the snow. They were only a few hundred yards away now. Murphy emptied his carbine into the advancing enemy, but it was hopeless against such overwhelming numbers. Then he looked toward the burning M10 tank destroyer nearby. The crew had escaped, but the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the turret was still functioning. It was an insane decision. Flames consumed the vehicle while thick smoke poured from its hatches. The tank destroyer had become a beacon for enemy fire, and even worse, it was packed with high explosive ammunition and leaking gasoline. It could explode at any second. Murphy never hesitated. He climbed onto the burning wreck anyway. The metal scorched his hands and boots while smoke filled his lungs with every breath. He dragged the massive machine gun into position and checked the ammunition belt. It was still loaded. Then he stared out across the snowy field at the gray shapes of German soldiers advancing through the smoke. The Germans believed the tank destroyer had already been knocked out. They thought the battle was finished. They were wrong. Murphy squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber machine gun unleashed devastating fire across the battlefield. Its rounds ripped through trees and shredded light armor. The first burst tore through the leading ranks of German infantry. Enemy soldiers stopped in confusion, unable to understand where the fire was coming from. They stared at the burning tank destroyer in disbelief. No sane man would stand on top of a flaming vehicle loaded with ammunition. Yet Audie Murphy remained there, firing relentlessly into their ranks. For nearly an hour he fought a one-man war. While firing the machine gun with one hand and swinging the turret back and forth across the battlefield, he used the field telephone with the other to direct artillery strikes onto the advancing Germans. He shouted coordinates into the phone, demanding artillery fire closer and closer to his own position. The officer controlling the artillery nervously asked how near the enemy actually was. Murphy answered with grim humor. He told the officer to hold the line for a moment and he would let him speak directly to the Germans himself. Enemy tanks opened fire at the burning M10. Explosions rocked the vehicle while shrapnel hammered against the steel hull, yet the smoke pouring from the fire unexpectedly worked in Murphy's favor. It concealed his exact position. The Germans could only see flashes of gunfire emerging from the flames. At one point, an entire squad of German soldiers crawled forward through the snow trying to reach him. A squad of German soldiers crawled forward through a ditch until they were barely a few yards from the burning tank destroyer. They were close enough to throw grenades onto the hull. Murphy spotted them at the last possible moment. He lowered the machine gun barrel and opened fire point blank. Every soldier in the squad was cut down before they could attack. During the fighting, Murphy was shot in the leg. Blood filled his boot, but he ignored the wound completely. Flames from the burning tank scorched his face and singed his eyebrows while smoke blackened his uniform. Still, he continued firing without pause. Later, he explained his thoughts during the battle in the simplest possible way. He said he never thought about dying. He only wanted to kill as many enemy soldiers as he could before they reached his men. It was one wounded teenager standing against an entire army. Stories like this reveal what real courage looks like when everything seems hopeless. Eventually, the machine gun clicked empty. Murphy checked the ammunition belt and realized there were no rounds left. Beneath him, the fire had spread closer to the ammunition storage inside the tank destroyer. The entire vehicle groaned and crackled under the unbearable heat. He understood instantly that he only had seconds remaining before the wreck exploded. He dropped the field telephone and jumped from the burning turret. Limping badly from his wounded leg, he struggled through the deep snow toward the woods without looking back once. When he finally reached the tree line, his surviving men were waiting for him in shock. Seconds later, the M10 tank destroyer exploded violently behind them. Ammunition detonated inside the vehicle and hurled the turret high into the air. Had Murphy remained on the tank only moments longer, the explosion would have killed him instantly. His soldiers stared at him in disbelief. He was bleeding, covered in soot, trembling from exhaustion, yet he still refused medical treatment. Instead, he grabbed another rifle and immediately ordered a counterattack. Inspired by what they had just witnessed, the 19 surviving Americans charged back across the battlefield behind their wounded lieutenant. The Germans were completely confused. After enduring devastating machine gun fire and relentless artillery strikes, they believed they had been fighting a much larger American force. Shaken by the resistance of what seemed like an entire battalion, the German troops finally retreated. The Americans reclaimed the field. After the battle, they counted the casualties left behind in the snow. Audie Murphy had single-handedly killed or wounded around 50 enemy soldiers during the fight. When reports of the battle reached headquarters, many officers refused to believe the story at first. One soldier surviving for nearly an hour on top of a burning tank destroyer sounded impossible. But the surviving American troops confirmed every detail. The artillery officers confirmed it as well. Even the charred remains of the destroyed M10 seemed to stand as proof of what had happened there. Several months later, Audie Murphy received the Medal of Honor for his actions. He was still only 19 years old. By the end of the war, he had become the most decorated combat soldier in American history, receiving nearly every military decoration the United States Army could award, some of them more than once. When he returned home to Texas, he became a national hero. His photograph appeared on the cover of major magazines, and Hollywood soon invited him into the movie industry. He eventually starred as himself in the film To Hell and Back, recreating many of his wartime experiences for audiences across America. But despite the fame and recognition, the war never truly released its grip on him. This is the part of Audie Murphy's story many people overlook. Heroes pay a price long after the shooting stops. Murphy suffered terribly from what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. During the 1940s, it was often dismissed as battle fatigue, and veterans were expected to remain silent about it. Society told soldiers to hide their pain and simply move on. Audie Murphy could not. He suffered constant nightmares and slept with a loaded pistol beneath his pillow every night. Sometimes he woke up screaming and firing at the walls, convinced German soldiers were attacking again. At one point, he locked himself alone inside a hotel room for days while trying to overcome an addiction to sleeping pills. The war left him angry and emotionally volatile. He struggled with gambling and personal problems, yet unlike many veterans of his generation, he eventually chose to speak publicly about his suffering instead of hiding it. Murphy openly told Americans that war was not glorious. He described it as hell that continued long after soldiers returned home. Using his fame, he fought for better treatment and understanding for military veterans struggling with psychological trauma. He helped show the public that even the toughest soldiers could carry invisible wounds inside them forever. Audie Murphy died in a plane crash during the early 1970s. He was only 45 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, where his grave became one of the most visited resting places in the cemetery. His headstone remains surprisingly simple. It lists only his name and rank without displaying the enormous number of medals he earned during the war. There simply was not enough room on the stone to include them all. The story of the burning tank destroyer almost sounds fictional, yet every part of it truly happened. It stands as proof that physical size and overwhelming odds do not always determine the outcome of battle. Sometimes determination alone changes history. Hundreds of German soldiers looked toward a burning American tank and believed they had found an easy target. What they failed to realize was that standing on top of that wreck was one of the toughest young soldiers America ever produced. Audie Murphy once admitted that he could never forgive the enemy for what the war had taken from him. Whether his incredible bravery came from anger, loyalty to his friends, or simple refusal to surrender is something history still debates today.